on the phone, always a pleasure to welcome one of my favorite writers in the entire world. In the entire world. Not just in the Western Hemisphere, but the entire world, ladies and gentlemen. David Dayen. David, welcome back to the program.
I think you're shortchanging writers from far-flung places like New Zealand or maybe Indochina. They deserve a shot.
Well, that's why I say one of, because there's a couple over there that I do also appreciate. But
Absolutely.
But you and I mean, I know, you and I share the same frustration about this story. And it is, you pointed out that it's one of the few sort of anecdotes or comments, or it's one of the few things that's actually been pulled from Barney Frank's book, and it is incredibly important. Just tell us what it is as a tee up, because I asked this question, and I probably asked this question to Barney Frank, to be honest with you, because I saw you writing about the interview that he gave in the New Yorker magazine. I don't know that for a fact, but I imagine that's the case because you've been on this.
I wrote about it at the time. Matt Stoller wrote about it at the time. 2.5 years ago, he told this little anecdote to New York magazine, and he includes it in his book and expands on it a little bit in his book. And the anecdote is this: that at the way that TARP works, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, there was language in it that said, in addition to giving all this money to the banks to nurse them back to health, you need to use TARP funds to prevent foreclosures. That was in the statute. And the TARP money came out in two tranches. It was $350 billion each time. And the first tranche, the Bush administration simply did not use any of that money for foreclosure relief, as they were directed to in the statute. So Barney Frank got pretty angry about this, and he held a hearing and berated Henry Paulson for going against the wishes of Congress. And just to back up, the TARP would not have passed without that language. TARP failed the first time it came up for a vote, and the way in which they got Democrats back on board enough to pass the statute, remember Democrats controlled Congress at the time, was that they promised this foreclosure relief.
What does that mean, foreclosure relief? I mean, like an explicit term.
What it meant is that a chunk of the TARP money was going to go to help people save their homes. There wasn't language specifically on what it would do in the statute. It gave discretion to the executive branch, but it said money is going to help people save their homes, money from TARP that we're authorizing right here. Now you figure it out how to do it.
And so that could have been like a during the Great Depression, you could be actually buying up people's mortgages.
And then selling them back to them. It could have been direct debt relief, like a check. It could have been anything. There was no limit on what it could have been. And the second part of this that Barney pointed out was that these banks are dependent on government support at the moment and would be susceptible to persuasion to reduce debt on their mortgage borrowers or have the money cut off. So that was the idea. And Barney continued to push on this, and he talked to Paulson, and Paulson finally said, all right,
wait a second. Let's hear. Well, I think now that we've set that table, here's where I start to ask Barney Frank that question. I think it was at Netroots Nation 2013. Here's that audio now.
One of the things that I read in interviews, at least one interview that you gave upon your retirement from the House regarding TARP, and I imagine these are bygone conversations, but very important stuff. One of the things that you had talked about in this New York Magazine interview was in the second go around with TARP, that you had conversations with Henry Paulson, regarding providing mortgage relief directly to mortgage holders. And Henry Paulson said, if you can get me the second chunk of TARP money, then I'm willing to do that if the incoming Obama people sign off on it. And you said that they wouldn't do it.
Yeah, it's a problem with the interregnum. People who are historians will remember this is a terrible problem between Franklin Roosevelt and Herbert Hoover. And in fact, we amended the Constitution, not me, older people. The new president used to take office March 4th. They moved it back to January 20th, but we still had too much of an interregnum. Yeah, I asked the Obama people to do it, and it now turns out Nancy Pelosi wasn't sure we could have gotten it through, but what we needed, if Paulson requested it, the way it worked is that money would be spent unless Congress voted to cancel it, but the president could have vetoed that, so it would have worked. But he said, I'm not going to do that, it's now like December, without Obama saying it's okay. And I asked the Obama administration, the incoming, and they said, well, we're not in power. He can do it if he wants to. It's what Roosevelt said to Hoover. If you want to do it, you do it. I'm not going to take responsibility until I'm in charge. And I understood in part what they were saying. We don't want to be held accountable because we're not administrating. But I was frustrated with both of them. And in fact, Obama said at that point, well, we only have one president at a time. And my response was that overstated the number of presidents we then had. And that was a lost opportunity. I was very frustrated.
So do you attribute that to a process? I mean, was it just simply a notion of process, or was it just simply not their policy?
No, I don't think it was not their policy, in fairness. It wasn't. Paulson was somewhat reluctant, but basically what happened was this. When we were voting on the TARP, Paulson said, can I have the money? And I think highly of Paulson. We've worked together, but he was thinking only of what was needed to keep the financial community from falling apart. We said you need two things. You need some limitations on compensation, and you need to do something about mortgage relief. He was reluctant, but we said, no bill if you don't do that. We're writing the bill. So we wrote into the bill the requirement of mortgage relief. And the New York Times had an editorial quoting me. I waved at him the bill, literally, the angriest confrontation I had with him when he said, I don't have the authority. Showed him he did. So he was reluctant, but finally I was able to say to him, you promised me, and we put it in the bill, and you owe this to those who voted for it. On the Obama side, they basically felt, and it wasn't just on this one, and it's what every incoming president says, don't tie my hands. You know, and they both had an argument. Paulson said, I don't want to take this responsibility and lock in the Obama people. Obama said, I'm not in charge. I don't want to be held accountable for spending money when I have no control. So I think it was risk aversion on both sides.
He was perfectly willing to tie the hands in regards to bailing out the banks.
Well, no, Obama supported that. On the first chunk. It was on the second chunk that he was reluctant to use the authority. Well, I take it back. His view was it was important to keep the economy from melting down totally, to get the money out right away. That's why he wanted the first amount without that. When we saw that he was doing that without it, we yelled and screamed, and then we got him to commit to doing it with the second amount. And Obama said, I'm not going to get involved before I'm involved. And Obama's position was, if Paulson wants to do that, he can do it. He has the authority, or Bush rather.
Right, and Bush was
in Texas.
Right.
I mean, we had a meeting in September or October, which McCain forced, and Bush was presiding, Cheney, and Democratic and Republican leadership of the House and the Senate, the Financial Services Committee, and Bush was sitting there, and somebody said to somebody else, we got to look at him, he's in Texas already. He was like staring at the ceiling.
Well, he's probably contemplating some of his artwork that he was going to be doing.
He did say at one point when McCain was showing a really irresponsible, he forced the meeting, he wouldn't say what he thought. I am told that Bush said to Nancy Pelosi, I told you were going to miss me, with regard to McCain.
So, I mean, is there not? I don't want to, I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but is there not some measure of inconsistency with President Obama being supportive of the first chunk when he's not president, but not being willing to sort of endorse the spending of the authorized second
Well,
chunk.
don't you act like I'm supposed to defend this. I'm the one who brought it out. I'm the one who was criticizing him, of course. I'm the one who said we have no president. Yes, I critical of both of them.
Fair enough.
But I would have thought that was clear. And when I say you've overstated the number of presidents we have, that's hardly an endorsement of the way they were behaving.
Right.
To say that they're both advocating responsibility.
So there you have it, David. And obviously, Barney Frank was getting a little testy towards the end as he
Well, as it's not a Barney Frank interview if he doesn't get testy at some point.
Indeed. But I mean, that is really that is the part that doesn't quite jibe. And you make that point that the Obama administration, President Obama, certainly had no troubles pushing other elements of TARP.
Yeah, you really hit a key issue, and you didn't even have all the ammunition, because what we learned when David Axelrod did his tell-all this year is that the Obama administration, while during the transition, before he was president, pushed the Bush administration to use parts of TARP to lend to the auto companies for a few months until they got into office. They had no problem using their pull prior to being president to tie their own hands to keep auto companies afloat. They had no problem with that. Homeowners, they had a problem with. That they didn't want to take the responsibility. So there's a clear double standard here.
And let's be clear, too, that when you commit to keeping the car companies out of bankruptcy in that way, when you commit to the car company rescue, which I happen to have also favored, that is, your hands are far more tied. You have a lot less sort of wiggle room there than you would in the context of we're gonna help foreclosure people.
Right. And what's the difference here? The difference is that keeping the car companies afloat didn't have much to do with the balance sheets of the banks, and keeping homeowners afloat did, because the losses that it didn't have to. There were ways that you could have done it without the losses being reflected on the bank's balance sheets, but the way in which people thought about it was, if you let people stay in these homes, if you cut their principal balance, then banks would have to reflect those losses on their balance sheets, and they would show that they are actually technically insolvent at this time, and it would be such a disaster, yada, yada, yada. So that's what the difference is that they were willing to go the extra mile before becoming president, breaking that sacred principle of only one president at a time. They were willing to do that in all sorts of ways, but they weren't willing to do it if it meant that banks had to reflect losses from a crisis that they caused. The crisis they caused was the massive foreclosure crisis, which was brought on by a host of illegalities in the origination and securitization process.
All right. Explain to people, just lastly, why it's so important to get this into. I mean, it's obviously in the record, but it's obviously something that has been really almost actively ignored by the mainstream media. Right? I mean, this is
It's been completely ignored. It has been completely ignored. And I mean, I was talking to someone yesterday, and they said, the way you really hide juicy information, critical information, is to put it in a book. So, sometimes this stuff can get sort of buried. But this is critical. I mean, there are academic studies that show that the failure to arrest the damage from the foreclosure crisis is the primary cause of our sluggish recovery that lasted 6 years. That the failure to get people, out of this crushing debt and relieve their situations is what tamped down consumer spending for all this time and put a lead weight on the economy. So this was a moment where the Obama administration, could have set themselves up for a much stronger economy and help millions of people with a handshake. This was not something that had to go through Congress. The previous administration was committed to it. We don't know what they would have done, but certainly they only had a few weeks in office at that point, and it could have been something built upon by the incoming administration. And they decided not to do it. And this was the point of highest leverage. The second tranche of TARP money hadn't gone out. Banks were still technically insolvent and at least reliant on government support. That was the moment when you say to them, all right, we're going to give you this money, but here's what you're going to do for it. But they chose not to do that. Instead, they gave all the money, nursed everybody back to health, and then said, could you help these homeowners who are being thrown out of their homes? And they were given the answer no, basically.
Well, yeah,
the HAMP program that was put in was entirely discretionary on the part of mortgage servicers, and they not only ignored it, but they used it actively as a predatory lending program by manipulating the terms of it to push people further and further into debt and denying them loan modifications and forcing them out of their homes. So this was a terrible decision that was only compounded by the decisions made after the TARP money all got out.
So there's two things that occur to me. One is that the idea that, look, the idea that it just worked out this way, that, it's clear that President Obama, it wasn't just a question of like, I don't really have the authority for this. It's clear that this is the policy, right? The old game that Paulson's playing here, like, you got to ask the president-elect, and the president-elect says, like, I'm not really the president, so I can't, it's like calling some type of, calling checking on your phone bill, and they go, well, I'm not authorized to do this. You need to check with my supervisor. All right, let me talk to your supervisor. The supervisor's not here. It's basically that scam.
Right. It was that kind of a game. It was a catch-22. It was a way to avoid responsibility for this massive crisis.
Right. How do we put off Barney?
Hundreds of billions of dollars of losses were in the system, and nobody wanted the banks to take any of them. And so if they denied responsibility for it long enough, they could ensure that the banks didn't have to take those losses.
And so people have to understand that not only was a conscious decision made to not rectify the situation on behalf of the banks, the situation that the banks are responsible for, but in service to the banks, we're not going to rectify the situation, and we're going to cause considerable amount of increased pain over the course of the next 6, 7, and frankly, like you make a point, we still have 1 million foreclosures in the pipeline. Maybe it's another couple of 2, 3, 4, 5 years. We're
probably in the 7th or 8th inning of the foreclosure crisis. Most of the loans that are delinquent right now date back to that period. The only reason they're not foreclosed upon is a combination of factors, one being banks lost the paperwork and don't actually know who owns what. And so there has been elongated foreclosure processes in many of the states that require a court order. But these are all legacy loans. These are all legacy problems that we're still dealing with. And we're still dealing with it because of that original sin, that when the banks were at their moment where they had the least leverage and they were most willing and sort of resigned to accepting terms, they wouldn't do it. Banks were preparing in meetings to deal with a world where they had to prepare for bankruptcy judges to be able to modify the terms of primary mortgages in bankruptcy. They thought that was going to happen because the Obama administration was preaching that on the campaign trail, and it's one of the things that in this handshake agreement, basically, Hank Paulson could have said, look, we're going to modify these terms unless you start doing something about it. He could have scared the life out of the banks. And they thought it was going to happen, and it didn't happen because the Obama administration pissed away the leverage that they had and tried to put these things together when they couldn't happen. And that was a very deliberate choice that they tried to pass bills when there was no leverage to pass the bill. Or they tried to put together something that was discretionary when there was no leverage to force the people at whose discretion it was to actually relieve homeowners. So that was the deal.
All right. Well, David, thanks so much for staying on this because, I mean, it's obviously very important. And particularly, Chuck Schumer, more than likely going to be the next Democratic majority or minority leader, depending on what happens in 2016 in the Senate. And this is a guy who couldn't be closer to the banks and very problematic. So, I mean, something obviously people should be aware of. David Dayen, always a pleasure.